It's recording. Okay, the recording is on. Oh, I see John Fnew's here. Welcome, John. John is our famous sacred geometer. Wonderful. And Wayne, thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming. Thanks for being here. So we begin. So tonight's course is called the Advanced Fractal Field Physics, a discussion that's in pursuit of what we pursued last week. Last week's course was called Introduction to Fractal Field Physics, and we're going to do a short review. But to carry this conversation forward, I'm literally going to read from the course outline. And the course outline was number 1, how and why Dan's work, Mark's work, and Nassim's work all begin with the sphere of dimension, Planck, length, and time. So that's the first thing we're going to discuss. Welcome, Holy Bailey. I'm glad you're here. Welcome, everybody. So what I was thinking was pretty remarkable was that if you project astronomically even hundreds of light years in all directions in the universe, something is remarkable in that Planck length and the time remains the same everywhere. That in itself indicates the universe seems to have a very common musical key signature, musical fundamental, a wavelength that divides evenly into every unit, every measurement of length and time that physics has ever measured divides evenly into Planck length and time. So it is the undisputed musical key signature, all of mass. And the fact that the entire universe agrees on this musical key signature, Planck length and time, is a strong indication that at one point the universe had some central communication device, which could even be an argument for the Big Bang. But this understanding that the universe is based on a common musical key signature called the Planck length is central to our discussion, and perhaps gives us an excuse to review what we discussed last time using this picture. So this will be a 5-minute review of the intro course, the central theme upon which we base tonight's course. So when you draw a sine wave inside this red circle that would look like a symbol for the Tao, as it were, and then you multiply by whole number powers of golden mean ratio, you get this shape of a wave called a caduceus, which we believe is literally phase conjugation. And we showed at fractalfield.com/mathematics of fusion that golden mean ratio in wave equations is proven to optimize constructive wave interference and therefore constructive compression. We know that Einstein said that if you had the solution to infinite constructive compression, you would have the unified field, and we believe that golden ratio phase conjugation is exactly that. So if you take that golden ratio cascade of Planck length and time, and you get then the exact radii of hydrogen from my new equation, which we'll discuss later, you get the exact only 2 effective frequencies that make photosynthesis happen. You get the very close to the exact Schumann resonance harmonics series. You get the heart rate variability LF and HF frequencies. You get the brainwave frequencies, which define peak perception and bliss. You get the sacrocranial tidal frequencies. You get the ear ringing frequencies heard by meditators. You get the virtually exact duration of the Earth year and Venus year. You get almost the exact frequencies that pre-reused Therify.net for healing and rejuvenation, and almost the exact frequencies Elizabeth Rauscher, the physicist, used for magnetics, and she achieved pain reduction in FDA study. And you get the essential dodecastellation 3D fractal symmetry of alchemic collapse, fusion, and transmutation. You get the geometry of DNA and basically every living protein. So you could make the argument that that particular series of wave geometries and precisely that scale and ratio, scale, Planck, length and time, ratio, golden ratio, phase conjugation, that if you fit in that geometry, and we use this picture here to talk about it, you create what Tom called a negentropic phase conjugate collapse wave, perfected implosive collapse. And that geometry then identifies almost all living things because you either get into that precise pattern of perfected embedding, we call it, to be part of perfected collapse, perfected implosion, perfected compression, literally 3-dimensional fractality, And that allows you to participate with the spin density at center, which is literally the Planck dimension. It's sort of like the wormhole to the collective exists in the phone called the Planck radio that happens at the center of that pine cone. And that's why we say we call this phase conjugation, visualize as in this picture right here, pine cones kissing noses. And at the very center of that pine cone, there's something called optimized translation of vorticity, which is how golden spiral is named in university classes on hydrodynamics. By optimized translation of vorticity, they mean perfected non-destructive translation of linear motion to rotational motion and back. And we suggest that rotational motion, which stores inertia and therefore defines mass, so rotation of charge is mass, and that rotation of that same charge defines a period called time. So rotation of charge is the definition of both mass and time, and that when that rotational energy called mass is translated non-destructively toward a linear energy called energy, the golden mean spiral allows the translation of mass to energy non-destructively. And we're going to talk about that extensively. But the side view and the top view of that seen in this picture suggests that at the very center, that tip where the pine cones would kiss noses in our metaphor, that Planck dimension at the end is where the adding and multiplying of phase velocities, having been constructive, translates that vorticity from a, in this case, transverse wave to a longitudinal or scalar or compressional wave. In other words, to say phase conjugation is how you produce longitudinal or scalar or compressional waves, which means that basically the up and down motion, the transverse motion of most electromagnetics, is translated in an orderly way because of that pine cone phase conjugation to this motion, a compressional wave that goes like this, the longitudinal, the scalar. And the compressional, longitudinal, scalar electromagnetic is demonstrably superluminal, that is faster than light, and will go through about anything without resistance, including the steel shell of a fusion reactor, allowing you to accomplish plasma containment at a distance and the physics of how the flame in the mind works. And we're going to get there in this conversation. The key picture being on the bottom right here, how that phase conjugation becomes understood as the cause of gravity in this hypothesis and in this course, which hopefully Mark is going to help me defend here if we do a good job. The way that phase conjugation becomes the cause of gravity is this picture right here. So that this is a top-down view of 5-10 spirals of golden mean, which happens to be a top-down view of every living protein and DNA, hydrogen, and demonstrably the geometry of the massless arrangement in the universe. So basically everything interesting is dodecahedral pent. And in that top-down view of those 10 spirals, of the golden mean, where those spirals converge recursively, they add and multiply constructively, not just the wave length, but the wave phase velocity. And this is the only geometry that allows recursive constructive adding and multiplying. Recursive addition is multiplying, and golden mean ratio is the only solution to that wave interference problem, therefore is the only solution to constructive compression. So when you add and multiply recursively constructively the phase velocities in only this geometry that golden ratio to Planck allows, then that geometry of compression produces the phase velocity waves constructively adding and multiplying towards center. So that produces acceleration of charge towards center from compression of charge towards center. And when you produce acceleration of charge towards center, I say that is called the gravity. So I say that gravity exists only in this geometry, and my new equation proves that this is the radii of hydrogen. We know this geometry is the known geometry, fractal and dodeca, of the masses in the universe, and the geometry of the Earth grid, and Ezekiel's whales, and City of Revelation, and all those interesting things. So that this geometry permits the production of gravity because the phase velocities add and multiply, making the front of the wave go faster towards center, and that acceleration is called gravity. In Einstein's sense that, you know, when you're pressed toward the floor on the elevator that starts going up, that acceleration toward the floor is indistinguishable from gravity. Acceleration is gravity. And we say since charge is mass, rotating charge, inertia is called mass, acceleration of charge is gravity. That's what this hypothesis this model suggests. So that was the essential intro. That was sort of like last week's course. I hope it wasn't boring. And where we went from there was to say that if you then rearrange systems, for example, the Schumann harmonics in that cascade, to fit that cascade better, they become more negentropic. So now we should summarize and say here, hopefully concisely, why is that geometry called phase conjugation, causing gravity? What makes that negentropic, self-organizing? What makes that increase order and thus cause things like rainbows and the possibility of perception and the possibility of the existence of color? Well, we could say it is old news that phase conjugation in optics is the first time that physics proved the existence of negentropy, self-organization. So phase conjugate optics arranged the mirrors to kiss pinecone noses arranged lasers to kiss pinecone noses like that, opposing lasers called four-wave mixing, called phase conjugate optics, and self-organization, negentropy, is well known and proven. So I say that example applies to the origin of perception, the origin of gravity, the origin of color, the origin of life force, the origin of bliss, because all those phenomena happen when the waves phase conjugate at the center where the pinecone kisses noses. So what makes that self-organizing? Well, if you visualize the center of those two pine cones where they converge, what happens is the plasma becomes so spin dense at Planck levels that only waves can emerge which are sorted into phase. And any wave which has not been sorted into phase cannot survive the compression through that little black hole at the center. And little black hole is probably the operative word here. So to make that point, or to review that point, here was the picture of the Schumann harmonics here in green, compared to the brainwave harmonics here in purple, compared to the calculated frequencies from my equation, Planck. And we see that we can reorganize the Schumann harmonics to make Earth more negentropic, and hence, hopefully, emerge from chaos, like weather and good stuff like that. But the example I wanted to use is here. So in terms of optics, in terms of the origin of color, to say why phase conjugation is the origin of color, and again, we did this last time, but just briefly, that the photon travels as donuts, and the donut is a torus, and the angle of that donut from 700 to 350 nanometers, the approximate octave called the visible spectrum, is actually a photon torus donut tilted from 0 to 180 degrees. You could almost prove that by saying that color is only perceived in the cone of the eye. And in wave theory, we know that you can only use a cone for measuring one thing, the phase angle of the approaching field effect, or donut. So because the cone of the eye is where you see color, it is a statement of fact that color has to be the phase angle of something approaches. And I say it's the phase angle of the photon as a torus donut. And specifically, if we model the octave of 700 to 350 nanometers called the visible spectrum as 0 to 180 degrees tilt of that photon donut, then green is precisely 90 degrees, and orange and yellow, orange and violet are 45 and 135 cubic angles. So the only angle not included is yellow and blue, and the exact angle that's predicted there is 63 and 117 degrees, is the face angle of this, as we discussed last time, the pentadodeca. So the photons get into the face angle of the pentadodeca, and that angle of tilt we call the rainbow. So I say that the photons are sorted into the rainbow because at the center of phase conjugation, every photon is sorted into these angles of tilt called the colors of the rainbow, which are actually tetracubic and dodeca face angles. So it says that those photon donuts emerged from the center of the rainbow sorted into exactly the phase conjugate dodeca angle, and thus phase conjugate is a cause of color. Okay, so all of this is just sort of a background to say that things like life force and perception, and we made the case right here, you see these are the two frequencies of photosynthesis are all possible because wavelengths have to agree to meet in phase conjugate golden ratio Planck angles, and that's what makes them self-organizing and hence create life and mind and perception and color and bliss. And they actually suck then the charge inward toward itself in the sense of Schauberger's water vortex becoming spontaneously cold just before it started making voltage from gravity. So that centripetal force at the center of the perfect piezo-doped vortex is also the principle of our imploder. So maybe that's about as much as we're going to do in terms of review. That was just the intro to the review of last week's course, and I remind everyone that last week's course, the video for last week's intro course, I'll put it in the chat window, fractalfield.com/conjugate gravity, is also the article that Mark and I worked on together. I see from the chat window that maybe some people are having trouble seeing the desktop. So this is the desktop sharing now, and you should see this image. I'm seeing this in the desktop preview. Let's see here. So you should be seeing this in the desktop preview. Let me see. I'm going to minimize this window. Oh yeah, sometimes that's better. Right. I need to remember to display the full window there so you can see it. Okay, thank you for reminding me. Okay, so that will help you see the full desktop sharing. So the next outline for tonight's course, point number 2, the wave mechanics physics role of golden mean ratio as a solution to constructive interference compression in Dan Winter's work, as a solution to global scaling with Nassim and the global scaling movement. So what Nassim did very usefully with the mathematics assistance of Elizabeth Rauscher, a very famous physicist, if we go to the conjugate gravity article, this was the top-down view of the radius of hydrogen here, and Mark helped me make this equation more available in Google Mathematics, so that 3 radii of hydrogen here are predicted by exactly my new equation, Planck times golden ratio to the 116, 117, and 118 power. So that was proof that this new radii of hydrogen is quite accurate physics. But what we wanted to talk about here was Nassim's discussion. Oh wait, we just can't pass by this without mentioning. This was Nature magazine's picture of the universe as a dodecahedron, that the masses of the universe was actually arranged in a dodecahedron. That was the cover of Nature's magazine. And then down below, this is the New Scientist magazine saying the universe is arranged as a fractal. So one magazine says the universe is fractal, the other magazine says the universe is a dodeca. Could they both be right? Maybe a 3D fractal is the perfect, a 3D dodeca is the perfect fractal. So here's what we wanted to talk about. We discussed this last week. So Nassim showed that if you plot in this picture, right here, maybe you can see my little arrow. If you plot the Big Bang, the atom, the Big Bang is like Planck. Big Bang, the atom, it's getting bigger, the solar system, the local galaxy, the extended galaxy, and the universe, and you plot those frequency versus radius on a simple line, where U here, for example, is the universe, and BB is the Big Bang. So these are those points on that line. This is called the scaling law for all organized matter, that the ratio between those points on that line are 1.612, 1.62, 0.639, golden ratio, golden ratio, golden ratio, and golden ratio. Basically, what he's saying is the global scaling law, and this was the global scaling movement for many years, was based on golden ratio. For example, classically in the global scaling movement with Hartmut-Müller, who also discovered some interesting communications implications and got in trouble, I suppose. But he said that if you plotted the mass of every living animal that we've known, that their body masses were not on a smooth line up a curve. No, the plot of those body masses were a caduceus, where the bumps on the curve of the maximum mass of the typical body masses of every living thing, the graph of those body masses is not a line. The graph of those body masses is a caduceus based on golden ratio, for example. So this is called the global scaling movement. So it shows that everything in the universe is working at fitting this geometry of implosive compression, phase conjugate collapse, because that's what makes them negentropic, self-organizing at center, because that implosion is what allows all waves to emerge from chaos, and therefore all of life, mind, and geometry, and all that good stuff. Number 3 in our outline was golden mean ratio in wave equations, and just a little bit further up above here we showed some examples, and maybe Mark may speak to this as well, but this was our friend, let's see, again, we're looking at the conjugate gravity article, fractalfield.com/conjugate gravity. And I'm not going to scroll so fast here to confuse you, but just here's the point that Sal Giandinotto, our friend, who is a really advanced chemist, did some great work with us on proving that the purify ecosify accelerates fermentation rate, for example. But he helped us with these 2 papers, the incorporation of the golden ratio phi into the Schrodinger wave function using the phi recursive heterodyning. And he also wrote the superluminal transportation of high-energy particles through wormholes using the phi-based solution of the Schrodinger wave equation. Now, there's a famous mathematician named L. Naschie, E-L-N-A-S-C-H-I-E, who's very famous for hundreds of papers on golden mean ratio, very controversial. But golden mean ratio in physics is well known as a wave function that has important implications for wave functions. In other words, yes, golden mean ratio is about beauty, but the reason it's about beauty is because beauty happens, waves self-organize. It makes them beautiful, even on your face. So it's in our face. So let's see here. Mark, the next part of our outline mentions you. So here, number 4 in the outline, the background and significance to Mark's new breakthrough equation for the ratio of proton to electron mass, which starts with Nassim's Schwarzschild proton, what Mark refers to as muonic hydrogen, and proves protons exist because they are conjugate perfectly embedded, in other words, fractal, within electron shells. In other words, the fractal conjugate field of the electron shell embedding the proton is what allows protons to exist. That's a way of talking about Mark's work. And I'm going to introduce Mark and then turn it over to Mark here for a few minutes if he's in the mood. Yeah. So this is Mark's equation in front of you, and Mark's website is mentioned there as well. And so the questions we were going to ask Mark had to do with how this new radical equation, pure geometric ratio, for the first time showing that pure geometry is the ratio between proton and electron. That's radical. That's Elizabeth Rauscher's dream. And how is that proof or strong evidence of fractality or of conjugation as a model for gravity and negentropy? So, Mark, your turn. So this was a way of also helping Mark to preview his course, which is coming up next week, actually, I believe, where Mark will go into this in much more detail. So please, Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, I can go into a lot more detail next week, but for right now, basically from Nassim's work, you've mentioned the Planck. Let me talk about the Planck units first. You've mentioned the Planck length and the Planck time. Well, Nassim brings in the Planck mass and also his Planck spherical unit. And if you take the ratio of the Planck mass to a little volume sphere that has a diameter of the Planck length and call that the density of the vacuum space, so basically the vacuum energy, if you assume that ratio, and then you can actually start deriving equations. Like you had up there earlier, one of the equations was Nassim shows that the product.
Mark.
Yeah.
Mark, not to interrupt, but people are saying here in the chat window that they're having trouble hearing you. Let me see if I can just summarize that. Okay. So originally Planck was defined as a unit of length, time, and mass, and that ratio allows what again? Say again, Mark.
Yeah, the Planck the ratio of the Planck mass to the Planck spherical unit volume, that's the can be the density of space. I guess what I'm trying to get up to is the ether. And right now in our mainstream science, we don't really include an ether. And if you use this Planck mass to Planck spherical unit ratio, you can get a density for the ether and then derive equations. You know, if the audio is bad, Dan, maybe I should save this for my class. I'll do some debugging and you know.
Yes, it's under Mark that your mic seems a little bit muffled. Maybe we'll play with other audio for you. But the point you were making was that this also relates, I think, to Nassim's emphasis on the amount of energy in the vacuum of space. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. Because there's the thing that's called the vacuum catastrophe, where cosmology and quantum physics doesn't agree, and they give radically different values for that. So they pretty much assume that it's zero. However, quantum mechanics is starting to consider virtual particles in the vacuum, and I think it's more than that. As Nassim says, it's most of the things are an ether of the space. It's the space that defines objects rather than objects defining space.
Yeah, basically Nassim is agreeing with other physicists like Adam Trombley, who have talked about zero-point and vacuum coherence energy technologies have access to such huge amounts of energy because the vacuum holds inertia, and Nassim did some very helpful calculations about that. And so just to help us to visualize that, essentially the vacuum is like a set of, you know how they have those balls that would bounce in a row? Let me see if I can find the picture. I have a lovely picture of this, that by getting the centers of mass arranged in the universe in the geometry of this stellated dodecahedron, this pentsymmetry, a certain efficiency for the distribution of momentum is achieved that allows momentum be distributed over vast distances very efficiently. I had a lovely picture of that. Let me see if I can find it here. You know how you have balls on the end of a chain, and if the balls all touch each other and then you bounce one at one end, that bounce would be conveyed at a great distance with virtually infinite speed. Whereas if the balls do not quite touch each other, then the bounce goes much more slowly at a distance. And that is what creates this. So by locking those billiard balls at dodecahedral spacing, what happens is then the inertia can be conveyed with great efficiency at a great distance. That means if you get your wave nodes locked into this dodeca nest symmetry, then you have access to inertia passing through the center of the vacuum at specifically those intervals. I'm not doing a very good job of finding my picture, but let me give you a practical example. When the Kozyrev mirror people locate their transmitters, they do it on the Earth grid where they find the Earth energy lines have a critical mass of nanotesla flux density. This means that you place this cylinder, the Kozyrev mirror is basically a metal cylinder big enough for several people to sit inside of. And when you place that cylinder at a wave at an Earth grid cross nodal point, here's perhaps not the best picture, but this is a picture of that here. There we go. Just so we have some picture. So when you place your telepathy device, and it was a proven measured telepathy device, at these grid node cross points, then you much better achieve telepathy because the energy of the vacuum is crossing at this node efficiently. It's why you have a magnetic line cross point to start a labyrinth, for example, or a cathedral. So This then begins to refer to certain highways in interstellar space based on the similar dodecastellation. The ancients called this Dharana. It's sort of like the movie Stargate and Deep Space Nine. They're all based on the idea the wormhole happens where all the waves converge and compress efficiently. And so at these nodal points, you get perfected distribution of charge and therefore efficient communication. This is where all of the longitudinal waves line up. So this is a little background to think about how then zero-point energy devices work. Remember, we said that we think that a pine cone or a chicken egg, where you can measure 2 to 12 millivolts end to end, is basically a vacuum energy coherence device. Well, if you want to build a device that takes energy from the vacuum, the environment is critical. The kind of the old joke about this was the Joe cell people. You know, you have this concentric, again, metal cylinders concentrically arranged implosively, capacitively, and there's the grain structure. It's a whole fancy thing, the fancy Joe cell work. It's basically a way of doing Brown's gas implosive hydrolysis. And so they're driving along this Joe cell. It was imploding the water, and the hydrogen is coming out, and you're driving along. But if you happen to drive over a space which is a bad capacitive environment, for example, over a bunch of railroad tracks, suddenly your gadget would stop. Your zero-point energy device works terribly when you're parked over a railroad track. This is very important physics because the railroad track has the wrong kind of capacitance. It's not the kind of dielectric you need for charge distribution, and therefore zero-point energy is much less available there. This is a very important lesson for those of us who are trying to understand biological architecture, for example, because the capacitance of your body does terribly in a steel box. Planting seeds does terrible in a steel or aluminum box because it's harmonic exclusive, not harmonic inclusive. It's a low dielectric instead of a high dielectric constant, which means the capacitance of your body can't ring like a bell. Charge distribution is impossible. And oh, by the way, you can't make phone calls to ancestors there. Korotkov measured it. No, the Kogi made phone calls to their ancestors in a very specific place he called fractal air, and we have those measurements. So you can see these lessons are fun to play with. Let's see if we're moving toward the next question in our subject outline for the evening. I'm at number 5 in the subject outline for the evening, which was, how does this radical equation for the pure fractal geometry of proton to electron ratio, which is Mark's equation, how is this proof or strong evidence for Dan Winter's phase conjugate model of gravity and neg entropy? Now, Mark, this was where you were supposed to come in. Are you still there?
Yes. How is this audio now?
I think I can hear you a bit better. Why don't you speak loudly and go ahead a bit, if you would.
Yeah. Well, the one thing that I think that comes out of it is it is a geometric ratio, and from that, things are, as you can, the platonic solids are, when you have the tetrahedron, which is the basic fundamental Planck structure of the vacuum. If you make the tetrahedron unit length, the vertices, then the rest of the platonic solids are going to be pi ratios of that. So that's what I'm thinking, is that because this equation works out so precisely to that 1,836.15267. I've known about this, that value since I had chemistry in high school. Nobody knew why it was that value, but when you plug in Haramain's equation using his contested proton radius, it gives you exactly that value that's required by the mass measurements. So I think since things are built up from that, it is a geometric solution, and it's similar to the amplitude hedron that the researchers pointed out in Wired magazine and Quantum magazine, that they can solve a whole bunch of work with a geometric pattern, geometric type solutions.
And we have that article where we which we reviewed last week here, where we see that the nuclear hadrons are clearly arranged. This is the Platonic stellation explaining the geometry of both the electrons and the hadrons in the nucleus from the work of chemist Moon at University of Chicago and 21st Century Magazine. And if we look, here is a model we talked about last week of the Platonic geometry of the electron shells. I see that there's some delay when these images get to you, but most people know about this sort of Platonic nesting as a way of accurately modeling both nuclear and electron shell chemistry. And Nassim is famous for using the tetrastellation. And Nassim and I both have agreed with basically Bucky Fuller that this, let me see if I can get this in the camera, maybe you can see this here. But this is, Nassim and I both sort of arrived at this from independent study, but here is the stellated tetra called cube octa from Bucky Fuller's jitterbug, when I learned this personally from Bucky. But if you stellate the tetra to make this cube octa, and then you do non-destructive collapse, here's the cube octahedron, and here's exactly the icosahedron. And this is called the jitterbug. There it goes, both ways. And then if you further do this compression, you have cube octa, icosa, and octa. And then if you rotate those same two opposing faces, you have exactly tetra. So this is an indication of the wave mechanics, particularly, and Nassim and I both have emphasized this separately from separate study, that this path from the cube octa to the icosa, this specific jitterbug here, is a path from a tetra symmetry, cube octa symmetry, to icosa, which is basically icosa dodeca. It's the 3D fractal we're always talking about. That wave path is specifically how superconductivity happens, because it makes this implosive path through center for the waves, and the implosive path through center is three-dimensional fractal. This is the Star Mother kit. That eliminates resistance as the charge waves implode passing through center, and is the mechanism of superconductivity, and therefore relates to many other things, because monoatomics have that geometry, noble gases have that geometry, stellated dodeca. Clathrates, the water's most magical symmetry, has that geometry, clathrate cage water, dodeca. And Buckminster fullerene has that geometry, the most exciting and interesting geometry for carbon, and carbon nanotubes and carbon sheeting, all of which are superconductive related. And this is a beautiful way to begin to think about or be introduced to a lot of things that Keshe is doing, and we have lots of friends who are involved with that work. And that article, fractalfield.com/cold plasma. So once you understand the fundamental reason that monoatomics, noble gases, and even gold, palladium, platinum, the PGM platinum group metals, their outer valence electrons are completed dodeca icosa, DF subshell. So all of those things have their magic alchemic implosive collapse quality. Remember, alchem, chem means access to a black hole, the place of the blackness, chemistry. So all that alchemic magic all happens only with one geometry, the completed stellated dodeca icosa. And so this is non-destructive implosive collapse, key to neg entropy, and the key to, it seems, if you say that, you could make the case that virtually every problem in science and social sciences is a problem of compression. If you solve perfect compression, you could do urban design, you could do alchemy, you could do isotope transition, you could do fusion, you could do perfect computer compression, you could do mindfulness, you could do bliss, you could do, all these, you could do alchemy. All these problems are problems of compression. So if you solve the problem of compression, suddenly all the mysteries open up in front of you, and then you can zoom in through living cells and see the universe and all the magic, and it's cool and fun. All right. So did we answer the question, is this evidence? So Mach wrote an equation, pure geometric geometry of the proton to electron mass ratio. And in the process, since he used, let me see if I'm summarizing correctly, Mark. In the process, since Mark used Nassim's Schwarzschild proton to write his equation. There's Mark's equation. We had it up here a minute ago. So since Mark used Nassim's Schwarzschild proton to write his equation for the mass ratio of the proton to the electron here, what conjugate gravity? Somebody closed the window on me.
Hey, is this microphone work any better, Dan?
I can hear you fairly well there. Maybe that's a bit better. So yeah, so to finish the thought, Mark used Nassim's Schwarzschild proton muonic hydrogen value and to complete his equation, which then correctly predicts the mass of the proton to the electron in a simple, very elegant geometry, and the equation is in front of us right now. And therefore, this tends to be a proof of Nassim's work's correctness. And in the process, since Nassim's work evidenced golden ratio in the universal scaling factor, it tends also to suggest that this embedding conjugate principle is also correct. And Mark was kind enough to suggest that then this is pretty strong evidence that Dan Winter's phase conjugate work is also implied to be correct. So, Mark, do we agree?
Yeah. You know, I'm still doing a lot of work studying the phase conjugate stuff, and from what I understand, that basically whenever you're talking about real measurements like real power, real mass, it requires a phase conjugate type equation. Whenever you take a complex analysis, it's you always use a real times a phase times the complex conjugate to get a real number. So there's still some more research that has to go into this, but it was the main thing I was trying to point out there was it was really clear to me that Nassim's work had to be right, and since he has that fractal scaling law of nature that shows the phi ratios,
exactly.
Also
so we're
your work about the discussion of gravity, and I wanted to mention a little bit more about the gravity that when you mentioned it's the charge implosion. And one of the things I've learned from reading Richard Feynman's work is Richard Feynman says that light will sniff out, to use the word sniff out, all paths. And he uses a line integral in probabilities. And he uses a line integral in probabilities, and that appears to be correct, that light does check all paths. So that's what I'm thinking is when you talk about charge implosion, when charges move, they generate electromagnetic radiation, which is light. So some of that light is going to find that perfect phi spiral implosion towards center. And as Harriman has said, that the proton, most ordinary matter, behaves like it's a black hole. It's not. He's not saying it is a black hole. It behaves like that. I think there's a chance that electromagnetic radiation, a portion of it, finds its way into this perfect implosive spiral path to create the gravity. And as it's absorbed, it's also re-emitted by the matter. Now,
I think that's beautiful, Mark. That's so helpful that light has to find the best way to get to center. So it explores all the paths, and it finds the paths of maximum constructive interference called the golden spiral, and that is implosive collapse. And you bring up another lovely thing here, which is that new information, Richard Hawkins and others, that something is coming out of the center of black holes, and it's very organized. It's the phase conjugate sorted. After a fight in an Irish pub, they say it's all sorted. Well, the waves come to the center of the phase conjugation, and they do their maximum compression, and everything emerges sorted. And so that's the nature of the perfect squeeze at the center. And you just described another way to talk about that, which I think is beautiful, Mark, which is, you know, the light is finding it explores all paths, it sniffs it out, as you said, Richard Feynman, and it finds the best path, which is the path of least interference or maximum constructive interference, which we have proved is golden ratio is solving that on a line and therefore in a dodeca.
Yeah.
So
can I add a couple other things, Dan? I've read a lot of Richard Feynman's work, and he's a Nobel Prize winning physicist. And he has stated in his books, he said that one day we should be able to use fundamental units like Planck units to describe what is mass. And
exactly.
And this is what I think that Nassim and you and Elizabeth Rauscher, and I guess I contributed a little bit there with the equations, just because it makes so much sense. I think that's what we're coming up with, is what Richard Feynman was dreaming of. And he actually criticizes string theory and says, hey, they don't calculate anything. Where are the masses coming from?
That's right. So that by quantizing by Planck times golden ratio phase conjugation, you predict units of dimension, units of mass, and units of self-organization, the symmetries of possible self-organization. Well, that's great. I do think, Mark, that next time we need to find a different microphone for you because it's just not quite clear enough.
Yeah, but, okay. Let me go ahead and mute out and let you go on. I think.
But Mark, your input tonight has been gorgeous, and thank you. I think you're right on the money, and I think you're thinking, and it's such a constructive. And this is the live, real-time thinking of a. You know, Mark has a great background as a electrical engineer as well, so he's converting this directly to electrical insights, which is why he's helping us evaluate some of the Keshe stuff, which is wonderful. So that was really helpful thinking. So out the center, explosive black hole phase conjugate at the sphere called Planck length and time and mass. Then you have the waves emerge from that center where the pine cones kissed, having been organized, self-organized, and the disorder is canceled and only order remains as in phase conjugate plasma called therify.net. Wonderful. I think we should, before we move on with our outline here, and really invite people to join Mark's more detailed discussion next week. And we'll play with Mark's microphone and get clearer audio there too. But Mark has real insight, and the next time Mark will be leading the discussion and I will be just mostly listening. But I wanted to try to answer some of Lisa's questions here because she's been very patient. So Lisa asked, if I understood correctly from the last lecture, when the s orbitals are in perfect alignment, then from that alignment the pi orbitals can be generated. Well, I don't know if you remember from the picture, but if we believe the sort of electron microscopy models, let's see where I just had that picture here a minute ago in the creation picture, that the s suborbitals, here it is, I found the picture, I'm good. So it'll show up on your screen in a moment. So this is the s suborbital, a little blue donut with two teardrops coming from opposite sides. This is the latest physics model of the s suborbital. It's a donut, very simple. The pi suborbital, on the other hand, is literally a cube. Here's the pi suborbital from occult chemistry, and here's the pi suborbital from the latest subatomic electron microscopy. And in both cases, it's a cube. Well, so you could take three donuts, three pairs of vortex. Remember, one pair of vortex called a donut is two electrons, and that's what an s suborbital is, one donut. Three donuts, three pairs of vortex is a cube, and that's six faces, six vortex, and that's six electrons in the pi suborbital. So that all fits together perfectly. You just take one donut and nest it in three donuts, and you go from 2 electrons to 6 electrons. That's S versus P suborbital. The more fun part is where you take that tetracube then, the pi orbital, and you nest the cube in the dodeca, and then you get the DF suborbitals. The D and F suborbitals are 10, 14 electron, 5, 7 vortex pair, dodeca-ecosa. So how you put the cube in the dodeca should, which we know is the 32-degree tilt, should tell you something about the chemistry of how you nest pi suborbitals and D and F suborbitals. And it just says that your chemistry teacher did a bad job unless he told you that you needed to visualize platonic nesting in order to visualize chemistry. chemistry means, chem in the ancient languages, access to a black hole, access to implosion. So this is so important because if you can't visualize waves well, you'll never steer them with your mind. And that's where we're going next in our class. Let's see. Did Lisa have another question? She says, if it behaves like a black hole, what are some of the behavioral characteristics that are being referred to? Yeah, well, a black hole basically sucks in everything. In fact, it really sucks. And what we're saying here is that the origin of everything that has suction to center, everything that's centripetal, is based on exactly what we're talking about tonight, phase conjugation. So my hypothesis that all centripetal forces, what Schauberger was working on, implosion, electronegativity. Why is electronegativity so therapeutic? Why does it heal? So why is it bacteriostatic? Electronegativity is powerfully centripetal. Why is when you make these black holes, suddenly things start to get colder? The tip of our plasma tube in the Therify gets colder, Paul told me. And the reason is because it's implosive, negentropic, just like Schauberger's water vortex got colder. And the doctor who in Perpignan stuck his finger, who just cut his finger, stuck his finger right between the two plasma tubes and said, oh, the pain's going away. It was cool. It was very healing. But he said, oh, my finger got a whole bunch colder. And so what is cold? It's just increased order. So this is a talk about what are some of the behavioral characteristics that are being referred to. Joshua commented, golden spiral, infinite compression, right. Mark says, you're welcome. Isn't electropositively centripetal? That's a good question. Yeah, it really does get confusing. Which one is centripetal and which one is centrifugal? And you could have this argument for days with the Chinese medicine people about yin versus yang. One people says it's centripetal and centrifugal. What I would say, one place I would go to look at that question of, which is more centripetal, the proton or the electron? And I think there is one place you can go to actually talk about that question. It's a hard question. The yin-yang people, they'll be fighting for forever about that question. But one place you can go to talk about that question, I think, is magnetics. And here, this is the article, goldenmean.info/magnetics. And if you look at magnetic south versus magnetic north, and you talk about one being centripetal and one being centrifugal, and you look at which pole of a magnet will accelerate healing by accelerating compression, it's centripetal, versus the other pole of that magnet will reduce healing but reduce pain because it unpacks. So you can clearly make the case in 3 separate books on magnetics which pole of a magnet increases pain and therefore healing rate. One is centripetal and one is centrifugal, and you could prove it. So I'm not going to try to finish that argument today, but I'm just suggesting a place to look to try to prove that one magnetic pole, positive versus negative, south versus north, is definitely more centripetal, and the other is definitely more centrifugal, and you can prove it. And by the way, we make money with that because that's how we made our decision of which face of the magnet to face in theimploder.com. It's a true solution to restored centripetal forces in agriculture. Remember, Schauberger, healing is restored centripetal forces. Negentropy is restored centripetal forces. So it is all about get centripetal or get dead, which goes nicely with my bumper sticker, get fractal or get dead. Okay. Robert Rivard, focused alignment. Just a focused alignment of light by way of phase conjugation using golden mean ratio. Yes. So Robert Rivard is saying, is matter just a focused alignment of light by phase conjugate golden mean ratio? And I say absolutely yes. And then he says, is gravity the perceived density of matter? No, gravity is the phenomenon of charge acceleration towards centers of mass, which is centers of rotating charge, caused by phase conjugation. So if you arrange mass, which is rotating charge, at spacing called phase conjugation, that allows that charge to create acceleration of charge towards center, and that's gravity. Next item in this evening's conversation. there will be a 1 minute a 1 minute pause while we invite another guest of honor for the evening here. Sarah, are you going to play with us this evening? We have another guest of honor this evening who, this is Sarah, everyone. Please say hi to Sarah. Maybe you could just wave here.
Hello.
So Sarah is studying what I call, I'm not sure what she calls, but some forms of very advanced practical shamanism and shamanic healing. And we're going to use that as an example to talk about our next little piece here. So I'm going to introduce that a little bit more and then turn it over to Sarah. For just a minute, Sarah is doing another course at Fractal U at 7arrows.net. And those 7 arrows are the 7 axes of spin symmetry through the tetrahedron. And Sarah's going to explain very practically that becomes useful as a shaman is projecting plasma. And this relates to the next subject on our curriculum this evening. I'm going to set this up and then, okay? So the next item in our curriculum, number 6, in the outline for tonight's course, is about, quote, the flame in the mind. Now, later in tonight's curriculum, there's a section called Conjugate Interferometry, where we show that longitudinal waves, when they reconverge at a distance, longitudinal electromagnetics, when they reconverge at a distance, they resynthesize or conjugate and produce transverse waves again, electromagnetic, which is to say heat. So here's the longitudinal waves approaching at a distance, and the longitudinal wave is faster than light, will go through anything, and does not produce heat, no resistance. But when they reconverge at a distance, suddenly they make heat again at a distance because they make transverse again. And this was called the Foo Fighter, the Nazi bell. This was called plasma containment. This is the Holy Grail. This is called the flame in the mind. Now, what does this have to do with the advanced physics course for tonight? Well, remember we said that the right and left hemispheres of the brain are making this golden ratio cascade of alpha-beta brainwaves. And then we found out that the right and left hemisphere at the moment of psychokinesis and making the flame in the mind, the right and left hemisphere have to be 180 degrees out of phase to phase conjugate. Just like the 2 pine cones have to be to accurately kiss noses, just like the 2 lasers have to be to accurately phase conjugate, just like the 2 plasma tubes in the therapy have to be exactly 180 degrees, so that at the center you have the longitudinal waves converging in mirror symmetry, 180 degree angles, and there they resynthesize the centripetal force because the longitudinals resynthesize. They pine cones kiss noses. And this is, we talked about the story last time, this was Ingo Swann in a laboratory heating a thermistor at a distance with his mind. He was lighting a flame with his mind at a distance, and that thermistor, that temperature sensor at a distance, was inside a Faraday cage, meaning the no transverse electromagnetic got through that Faraday cage, only the longitudinal. So it had to be longitudinal waves that allowed Ingo Swann to light a flame with his mind. And you know, no Tibetan Bonpo or Cherokee gets initiated until they can make a flame with their mind. So what have we learned practically? Well, number 6 in our outline curriculum for tonight, long-term implications for the physics community of this new physics of perfected geometric embedding, fractality, phase conjugation in understanding current mysteries in physics. And we wanted to use this psychology with Sarah as an example. For example, can the multiple connected faster than light speed in the double slit experiment, Bell's theorem, be explained because phase conjugate longitudinal waves, the so-called flame in the mind, are faster than light and perfect plasma containment? In other words, you know what Bell's theorem is. You got this little ball of light, and then a photon jumps off in opposite directions. But the thing is, if you mess with one photon over here, and you perturb it, the photon going the other way at speed of light times 2 is suddenly perturbed. So something got between this photon and that opposing photon at twice the speed of light because they were locked into phase when they emerged from the central flame or the central bit of light. And so the hypothesis here is they emerged out of a phase conjugate wave packet And that's what allowed the one over here to communicate with the one over here faster than the speed of light. And specifically, this hypothesis in physics requires that that communication faster than light happened at golden mean ratio multiples times the speed of light. And there's some preliminary evidence for that in Raymond Chow's work on waves that travel faster than the speed of light have been measured at 4.23 times the speed of light in Professor Raymond Chow's work, which is golden mean cubed. So how does this introduce Sarah? So Sarah was studying with a South American
Peruvian shaman
named
Carlos.
Carlos, yes. And Sarah began to learn some healing techniques. But then Sarah met another school, wasn't it a lady that was teaching about the 7 layers?
Yeah.
What was her?
Alejandra Casado.
Yeah.
Alejandra Casado from Argentina.
Quite famous, I think. And she was teaching people to visualize 7 figure 8, 7 spins?
Yeah, 7 spins. It's like a system of references where you learn to focus your attention, and you learn also to make the difference between both hemispheres and learn how to the qualities. You learn from how to project and steer your attention to embed the space.
Yeah, that's exactly where we want to go with this, and Sarah's going to explain a bit more about this being a key to empathy and maybe even bliss in a moment. But to set up the physics just a little bit more, well, first of all, Joshua Pronk, thank you for suggesting we may be describing how to optimize quantum entanglement. Thank you. I think, Joshua, that's exactly what we're talking about, and we're saying that entanglement is perfected in the geometry of golden ratio conjugate embedding. So perfected embedding, which is phase conjugate golden ratio fractal, is perfected entanglement, is perfected compression, is fractal, etc. That's exactly what we're saying. Thank you. But so here it is that we know that when dyslexic kids are taught to walk in a figure 8 and do a cross crawl with their knees, in Deborah Sundbeck's famous book, Infinity Walk, that she could eliminate dyslexia in measured reading skills in children within weeks by causing them to do this figure 8 motion. And what it did, it forced the blood in their brain to do this figure 8 motion, and you could feel the center of the corpus callosum at the top of their head getting hot as they did this, and suddenly their dyslexia disappeared. Why? Because the blood is crossing the figure 8 at the center, tying the slip knot, and sorting out the right from the left, and suddenly no more dyslexia. So you compress the conjugation where the 2 pine cones are crossing at the center of the figure 8 of the head, and suddenly you eliminate dyslexia, which is to say you help them get it sorted. Well, Sarah is taking this to what I find to be a wonderful practical implication at 7arrows.net, and she will be teaching a course on this. The way I would like to introduce that is to say that we know a shaman can steer a tornado because Joshua could be optimizing the corpus callosum. That's right. The corpus callosum, by the way.
Exactly. That's it.
Yeah. I think you got it right. You're optimizing the corpus callosum. It's interesting. There's medical documentation that there's more wires across the corpus callosum of the dyslexic. So that's why they're more creative. That more stuff goes between the right and left. But in order to get that sorted across that famous spark gap, you have to tie the knot tighter, which is to get the pine cones kissing noses more accurately. And that's where the figure 8 exactly connects the right and left. Exactly, Joshua. I think you got it. Yeah. But so we're back to this steering a tornado. So if you watch a shaman steering a tornado, this is a review. Most of us have heard this. We wrote this up at goldenmean.info/dowsing. But if you watch a shaman steering a tornado, the shaman says, I am eating the chucha of the tornado, which means I'm consuming the anger, which means I'm feeling the pain of this tornado. And I'm thinking of Sarah in her shamanic healing clinic about to work with healing someone. And so the shaman says, I'm eating the anger, I'm feeling the pain. And when the shaman feels the pain, basically feeling the pain means to feel where the fractality is bleeding, because the fractal's broken, so it's bleeding charge. And so to restore that compression, that centripetal force, you have to feel the pain and embed. And so you see, a clairvoyant would see bioplasmic streamers coming from the belly of the shaman, embedding in the tornado. And eventually, if you're clairvoyant, and we have friends that do, and you actually see the aura of the shaman, the plasma body of the shaman, embed itself in the tornado, and you become the center of gravity of the tornado. And suddenly, not only are you seeing through the eye of the tornado, but actually the tornado is following you around like a puppy dog because you've become its center of gravity, as proven by the fact that the tornadoes always follow the center of lowest pressure. And you create the center of lowest pressure, which thus means you are steering the tornado. So, now, if you visualize the 7 arrows of the tetra cube in your space, you suddenly take control of that space, and therefore you steer the tornado. And that's why I think this is a fascinating example of how you make the flame in the mind. And so maybe then you finish the thought. So that was what I wanted to set up, Sarah.
Yeah.
So the reason I got so excited about this was when Sarah said then she tried it in the clinic, and she was actually able to help someone get to a kind of bliss experience.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, you need to, this system of reference is just to learn how to focus in these conjugate points that all creation has. And and once you do it, it's like your own perceptions naturally embeds in any living thing. So, well, this is like a day-by-day learning and this is like a technique that you can apply to everything.
So, and you actually do these very accurate visualizations of the figure 8 motion in 7 levels, don't you?
Exactly. Let's see if there's
we had the pictures here. It's 7arrows.net, SEVEN, 7arrows.net. And this was the thing that actually, I think we had a bigger, yeah, there's a bigger version.
There you go.
There we go. So this was the group, which was Spanish. This will show up on your screen in a minute there, folks. I know there's a little delay there. But it actually showed the 7, it's kind of like the 7 levels of reality, but you're actually visualizing 7 figure 8s layered one above the other.
Yeah.
And when you finish that, suddenly you find...
Yeah, there's a perfect stillness.
Perfect stillness. Isn't that great? It's like once you have perfect perspective in the perfect stillness, and therefore perfect leverage.
That's and then naturally, like the person gets into a bliss experience. It's quite natural and genuine.
Beautiful. And interesting that we're just documenting with Therify.net that you have this phase conjugate plasma tubes, and Patrick, who is with us this evening, Patrick, who is a very skilled in sacrocranial pulse measurement, he was feeling, you know, how they feel the fascia to feel a low frequency spine liquid pump sacrocranial, and he said that in the Therify, most people almost rather quickly get to a 0 point, a still point in the spine liquid pump, and it's well known that if you're doing healing sacrocranial work, that when the patient spine liquid pump stops and gets to that still point, that's the turning point in the healing, because from that still point, the waves emerge more sorted into phase, more order, more phase discipline. And so,
which is like talking about negentropy again. And it's also, well, what Mark was saying, like it's the way the light finds the most direct path to the center.
Yes. And maybe, I mean, just Sarah is going to say much more about this in her course, but I'd like to invite Sarah to say talk about one more thing, which would be plasma projection. In other words, we're saying that bodies of plasma is what make the universe alive. We're saying that basically cold plasma is the charge around conjugate systems like the conjugate noble gases in Therify's plasma. And we're saying your aura at death is a ball of cold plasma that's centripetal enough, if you're coherent, and that you project it and you learn to steer that ball of plasma. And you know, I'm beginning to think of a shaman is defined as one who can project this. Do you agree?
Yeah, I do.
And I mean, a lot of us can talk about it, but not many people can do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I tend to think of you as someone who can do it.
But everybody can do it. It's just it's just a way to really, there's many people out there that has all these qualities related with empathy, empathy, compassion, and all those things. What I found brilliant is to have a system of references that teaches you how to have how to focus with your left brain, which is the logic. You need to have a universal logic in order to have the right embedding and to learn how to project your aura with avoiding thrust. You need to learn that that's the base of your common sense. You need to have common sense in order to steal your aura. So all those things are what this system of references gives the human in this case.
Isn't it wonderful that Sarah introduced the next point in our outline for tonight's course, which is the origin of propulsion? and we didn't even pay her to do that. That's great, Sarah. No. But so you see, it's nice when we continuously make the connection between the shamanic and spiritual implications of some very solid physics. And Sarah is bringing up the point that a shaman, by definition, is someone who knows how to steer their aura around. And we will use that as the example to talk about the next item in our outline for tonight, which is number 7. Star Wars. The Star Wars-like implication of new gravity technology based on conjugation, and our article, fractalfield.com/propulsion. There's 2 PDFs there. One is called Impulse Power, and one is called Warp Thrust. And we would like to understand the origin of propulsion from the shamanic perspective, which is what Sarah's referring to, with using this new phase conjugate physics of gravity to make it very real. So I'm going to bring up that article now. It's fractalfield.com/propulsion. And we're going to look at the key picture here. Here it is. Look at that. I even found it. Okay. So here's the key picture. It'll come up on your screen there in a second. So here is a spiral on a donut right there. See that? It's a golden mean spiral projected mathematically on a torus, which is a series of mathematic equations I did when I first animated the origin of Hebrew and Sanskrit alphabet. And this is the top view here, and this is the side or oblique view. And this is called the flame letter, element of flame. And we know that the shadow views of this spiral on the torus produce Hebrew and Sanskrit alphabets. And you index that 3D spiral on the torus, that the shadows, by the 7 arrows of the tetra, which is what Sarah was talking about. And if you index those viewpoints, you have Hebrew and Sanskrit. So why is that key to propulsion? In other words, throwing your aura around and becoming shamanic. Well, the PDF files here at fractalfield.com/propulsion, down the page, there's one called hydraulic propulsion and one called crystal propulsion. Here they are. If we click on the hydraulic propulsion PDF, we see that you can actually optimize the spiral path on the torus that allows you to create maximum propulsion. And we need to credit our friend Bill Donovan, who originally discovered this. He was watching his hydraulic machine shop, and the hydraulic machine had a slip knot in the pipe conveying the hydraulic liquid at high inertia. And every time that hydraulic pump would launch a huge amount of hydraulic fluid there, suddenly the heavy machine would leap off the ground. And so he began to realize that something was making some gravity in the way that slip knot was tied in the flow of that fluid. And what we began to realize was that the fluid was making a spiral on a torus in a way that could optimize lift. And this was a key to the Nazi bell. This was the key to how the Vimana flew. And I was just seeing if we could find those pictures in here for you. So these are some experiments we did. This was called non-compensated spin, where the rotation of this fluid on the torus, here it was just from the winding, what's called the trefoil from the ancient Celtic, and we did this loop, and we passed, we took a 2 horsepower high volume pump and passed fluid here, and we made about 1 kilogram of thrust. And this is from this map of the Irish Celtic knot in fluid flow here. But more powerfully, if you wrap this spiral on a torus, see if there's a picture of that here. So we assigned our mathematician, Martin Jones, to do some equations around this. And at the bottom of this article, you see those equations. They're called the Navier-Stokes equations. And it turned out, yeah, here, this is, so that if you optimize the wrap of the spiral around the torus, so you get non-compensated spin at the right angle, and you pump high inertia and high magnetic flux on that spiral in the torus, you create immense amounts of lift, immense amount of gravity. Now, just to be clear, we were using a $1,000 pump and very expensive hydraulics here. And as I mentioned last time, we reached another physicist who said, no, he figured out how they did it from the Nazi bell. See, when you read the engineering prints for how the Vimana flew, you see that they're actually got this spiral on a torus, and they're pumping mercury through it, high inertia, basically. But when the Germans studied that to build the Nazi bell, the Glocke, apparently they realized that you had this special wetting agent, and this was the secret. You get fine iron powder doped so it's soluble in the mercury, and you have the famous purple liquid of the Nazi bell. And now you have high inertia in the mercury, but also you have high magnetic flux inertia in the same path. And this other physicist says, no, I didn't use a $1,000 pump. I used a little aquarium pump, and we were making gravity. So if you do it with magnetic spiral on a torus, and this relates directly to some of Nassim's experiments, making gravity with diverting magnetic flux accurately around a circuit. Although I don't think Nassim understood the equations, Navier-Stokes, to optimize the spiral on the torus. The point being, the point being that if you visualize a spiral on the torus in your mind accurately, it's directing the flow of how your mind is projecting the smoke ring of your plasma, of your thought. In other words, if you agree with Karl Pribram, who says, your brain is a hologram, and therefore inside your head you're cooking up these toruses of charge, and then you're blowing smoke rings. That's what your thoughts are. And the sequence of the angles of the smoke rings you blow are called Aleph, Beit, Gimel, Dalet, the letters of the alphabet, which are simply the tilt angle of the torus. So you're steering these donuts at the right angles and blowing your smoke rings. So if you ever watched a Kabbalist or a rabbi making a golem, he closes his eyes and he fills the optical cortex. The entire visual cavity of the brain is filled with one Hebrew letter at a time, tilting that smoke ring at one angle, and then it's like the horse whisperer. You stamp your feet and you release your smoke ring, your torus of light, of charge, and you blow it toward the center, in this case, of your ritual chamber. And if someone on the opposite side of the chamber is doing the correct work, and if you've ever been in an Ophanim Enochian ritual, they're visualizing these Hebrew letters in these opposing pairs called conjugate four-wave mixing. And at the center of the Ophanim rituals, we clearly found that people were literally blown away in the magnetic wind. This is called casting a spell. And the reason it's a spell, a dream spell, is because the whole plasma of the circle of ritual has become centripetal enough at the center, so much so that you can blow the doors off a church, is the old joke. But the reason, and any good Druid ritual is not really powerful, obviously, unless the air pressure in the room changes. Why? Because you made it centripetal. So when you die, your aura is a plasma ball. It's a plasma donut. You know, we're not going to bring up all the pictures now, but Karakov measured what your plasma looks like when you die. And we know where it goes. It goes to the center of charge because it's trying to pick up centripetal velocity to be saved, so to speak. And so how are you going to steer? Do you have any idea how you're going to steer after you're dead? Well, what you're going to do is visualize these plasma donuts, and these are propulsion vectors in 3D to allow you to navigate. Okay, so this was called impulse power in Star Trek or Star Wars? No, Star Trek, right? But what they called warp power in Star Trek moves us on to the second PDF at fractalfield.com/propulsion. And again, credit here and thanks to Bill Donovan, who spent half a lifetime studying the Koski-Frost work. And the Koski-Frost was when the Bell Labs proved that a quartz crystal cube, if you cut the facet planes accurately in the cube to parallel the molecular planes, and then you dimension it properly to be phase conjugate. Then you put the phase conjugate pump wave, the same thing that we're putting into Therify, and you put that into this quartz crystal cube. Their measurements at Bell Labs proved this generated 800 times its own weight in gravity, in thrust. This is called Koski-Frost. And you can see the whole documentation at implosion group crystalpropulsion.pdf at fractalfield.com/propulsion. And according to Bill, the U.S. federal government went to a huge amount of trouble to remove that document from every university in the United States. You can go back and actually look in the history, and all the Koski-Frost documents were removed from every university library in the country. Guess who did that? Welcome to America. Why did they want you to know? Well, the same key to psychokinesis is the ultimate threat to national security. It's the old story. This is what makes it fun, I suppose. But anyway, the principle is that if you rotate a conjugator, you make gravity. Remember, the Keshe's people are taking the monatomic GANs and they rotate it in the reactor. And with the spin, and they array those reactors in tetracube, and it's a rotating conjugator, and they make lift, they make gravity. So, but the reason why rotating conjugators make gravity is the principle here. And you say, well, what's rotating in a conjugator in the quartz cube? Well, the quartz cube, the z-axis is a helix. And so the helical axis, the z-axis of the quartz, the same way the Rife scope worked, is rotating the phase conjugate pump wave. And that the direction of that axis of rotation is the direction of thrust of the Koski-Frost crystal. This is called warp factor, warp propulsion, and in Star Trek they called it the dilithium crystal. The correct term in electrical engineering would be lithium niobate, which is a phase conjugate dielectric. So again, we did say our excuse for talking about something a bit esoteric is this is an advanced course. And so this was a conversation about propulsion, and let me see if there are any questions here. Because intention compresses charge. That's right. The idea here is that a pure intention is a tension that is so distributable as a wave that it will permit compression. Optimized implosion of charge. Oh, and Brett has joined us. Brett is our honorary Keshe expert of the evening. Thank you for joining us from Florida, Brett. And Brett is announcing that you don't need to rotate it anymore. So quite often, the technology that Dr. Keshe is talking about the next day, they find a better way to do it. And he's saying, that's right. So probably what Brett is saying is, we just have the non-physical plasma rotation now. It's similar to when the first day Tesla said, well, we have to rotate this magnetic rotor in order to make a three-phase motor. And then he said later, well, actually all we have to do is we have to pulse the magnetic poles on and off in phase and create the illusion of rotation. So I think I can empathize here with what you're saying. And Wayne said, when I was a child, I played with a garden hose doing a similar effect. That's right. If you get the right kind of a slip knot in a garden hose and move up the flow, in fact, there are famous pictures of firemen getting their fire hoses into a slip knot, and suddenly the fire hose takes off. And so but it's very important that you imagine this accurately. Now, see if you can close your eyes and imagine a spiral on the torus. Why would a golden mean spiral on the torus, starting with rotation on the outside, when by the time that spiral reaches center, what was going around in a circle is suddenly going in a line directly perpendicular away from you, called an L, or a phase shift, or translation of vorticity perfected, or Elohim. You know, that L, or phase shift, is the ability to translate the inertia of charge that was called mass into a linear inertia called energy, in this case, a longitudinal component. So those who can make this L, or phase shift, were to be honored because they were coherent enough to project their plasma through the speed of light. And this gets into the more esoteric conversation, which is the amount of coherence in your aura. Your boat into the underworld is called your Ka, as in Catholic or Cathar. We can now know how to electrically measure to find out if the Pope is a Catholic, because we measure the coherence in his aura. But the Ba was the amount of charge in his aura that could withstand implosive compression and be translated into a longitudinal and thus penetrate through the speed of light. So the Ba was visualized as a seed that projected from the husk of the Ka, the Kaaba, the Merkaba. So your aura is coherent here, and the inertia is below the speed of light. But if you've got a very coherent aura, and then you can phase conjugate, and you have this bliss field around your theraphi or your brainwaves, and then a portion of your inertia can withstand this acceleration through the speed of light, becoming the Ba. And that is what is superluminal and immortal and travels the universe. The thing is, for your attention to track those superluminal velocities coherently is exactly the challenge of remaining awake in a lucid dream, or taking your organs of perception with you when you dream and when you die, which is the physics of why ability to lucid dream is such an excellent predictor of whether you will take memory through death. Your Ba from your Ka, the phase coherence. And that's, you see, that's all about plasma projection, actually phase conjugate superluminal longitudinal plasma projection, which is what the L predicts. So those who are the Elohim, actually they were wannabes, but the real ones are the ones who can lucid dream and project their aura through the speed of light. And this was what was meant by the fall, in the sense of Nephilim, the fallen ones, because losing that aura coherence meant they could no longer lucid dream, which means they could no longer take memory through death. And this is where we start our course on the extraterrestrial origins of DNA, and we talk about the hygiene of the Nephilim. Okay, Joshua's question here. The coherence of electromagnetic signals between each part of the body lead to plasma projection. You become more centripetal, therefore your aura grows. This is the premise of chakras. Yes, absolutely, Joshua. But also, it is the premise that your right and left hemispheres are making golden ratio alpha to beta, and they're 180 out of phase, making the pine cone kiss noses, and that's creating this longitudinal scalar flame in the mind. The physics of psychokinesis. Okay, so now I see it is 9:31, and there is one more element on our outline here. It's called fusion physics, phase conjugate interferometry, the holy grail of cold fusion. And there's an article that goes with this. We know that the main issue of why they're spending so much money at ITER and CERN was because they haven't figured out how to contain enough heat. So plasma containment is called the holy grail of fusion, because if you could do plasma containment effectively, they wouldn't need to waste enough money at CERN and ITER to feed Africa, because they could do it elegantly, the way the flame in the mind does it. And so we developed some technology, and this is Australia and Brazil, called conjugate interferometry, and originally this was in New Zealand. And our article here is conjugate yeah, here it is. Conjugate fractalfield.com/conjugate interferometry out. And you can actually see that link here, and here's the picture. So if you take the microwave dish and put the half transmission screen at half lambda and do this accurately, you can produce a focused longitudinal, and you can cause this to interfere at a distance, and you can make balls of fire at a distance, which was what the Nazi Foo Fighter was. Remember, the Nazis had learned phase conjugation because they had to for their radar, and those scientists all went to Russia. The Americans don't learn about phase conjugation, the Russians do. And this is what got Tom Bearden so excited, and he's a pioneer in the field. So what happens is the principle of why, one of the main reasons why a certain kind of paint will not deflect radar is because the thickness of the paint has to be that same half lambda, so that there's a phase conjugation at the reflection point from the surface to the bottom of the layer of paint, and that makes phase conjugation, and the bounce path then for that microwave is interfered with because of phase conjugate paint. And also, if you have certain very high dielectrics in the paint. So, you know, they're always thinking, well, this is the ultimate threat to national security. I say that's childishness because, in fact, the physics of how we phase conjugate is how we become self-empowered as a mind. So these things must be taught. It cannot be such a secret to national security that you can't explain to someone how to phase conjugate inside their brain, because if you can't phase conjugate inside your brain, you can't make a flame with your mind, and you will never get immortal. So I say we need to teach our children these things, and that's why I put this in this course. I'm not saying everyone should go out and do it, but I'm saying that the principles should be taught, in that if you could then cause these phase conjugate beams to converge at a distance, the longitudinal EMF microwave, very accurate wavelength, is then reconverging at a distance inside the steel ball where they're trying to make fusion happen. Where in the past they couldn't make a ball that could contain a heat enough because it would always melt the sphere, whether it's steel and they try to contain it magnetically. No, the plasma containment has to be done with interferometry, and that interferometry has to be longitudinal EMF interferometry. And if we could teach these physicists that, then they would save enough money at CERN and ITER and the Atom Smashers to feed Africa, and I think that would be cool. And that's why I think it's important to teach it here, in spite of the fact they're going to say, oh, well, national security is at risk because people might learn how to become psychokinetic. I say if we don't learn how to become psychokinetic, national security is at risk. So that's my opinion, dear NSA. So I am passionate to see that this concept of conjugation producing longitudinals, what are sometimes incorrectly called scalar or torsional waves, actually would be understood in very practical terms, because visualizing this accurately is truly the key to psychokinesis. It is the flame in the mind. When we were there with Dahani Wahoo at the Cherokee initiation at Sunray Community, and we were teaching her these letters from the Ophanim Enochian, and then she spoke up. She says, oh, those are the star alphabet of our ancestors, what was the ancestors of the Cherokee? They're called the Adawi. So the ancestors of the Cherokee, the Adawi, had an alphabet which turns out to be similar to the Ophanim Enochian, an angel alphabet of John Dee and Kelly. Well, what were John Dee and Kelly doing? They were calling big plasma bodies. Now, the context was that John Dee was an expert in hypercube mathematics, which is exactly how you do this implosion bit. And he had the largest library in Europe, probably. He spoke most of the languages of his day. He was probably the most educated man on the planet at the time. And he said, well, yes, but I really want to talk some angels. And then he met this Ophanim who appeared and handed this green stone, in which, if you looked in, you see these shadows of plasma, if you're a bit clairvoyant. And those index of those shadows of plasma was a hypercube called Ophanim Enochian alphabet. And so if you visualize these letters in a sequence correctly, you create an implosion at the center. And these are the actual letters, and we'll dig out the pictures later, but the actual letters used to make the movie Stargate were the Ophanim Enochian from John D. and Kelly. So what was the Stargate? They called it Dirana. Well, we now know that a Stargate is what we're making with Therify.net. Actually, it's a plasma projector, and if you're very coherent, you can go through the wormhole at the center. So, again, why is it important that we teach this kind of science to our children? Well, look, if you study, as I have, with some of the leading geobiologists on the planet, and I'm thinking of Stephen Cardinau's school, geniedulieu.ch, geniedulieu, D-U-L-I-E-U.ch, Stephen Cardinau's leading geobiology school on the planet. And they're quite convinced, having, worked with elementals and nature spirits for their whole lives, they're very skilled with this, that the elementals and nature spirits consider us drunk because we don't talk to them. Why? Because obviously our tornadoes and our storms are going to be in chaos until we learn to address large plasma bodies as if they were self-aware. So that's why I think it's a fun and useful educational story to talk about when Shakespeare, under the name of Francis Garland, described elaborately in John Dee's notes, Shakespeare arrives in Prague and learns this physics from Dee and Kelly, and later writes the play The Tempest. And what was The Tempest about? Well, the well-known politics of that time was that King Rudolph of Prague, Bohemia, knew that King Philip of Spain was nuts, and his favorite thing to do was roast Protestants for breakfast. He was insane, and he didn't want Europe to be taken over by that kind of Inquisition insanity. So King Philip helped John Dee do this activity, which was called the heptagram workings. I think that our expert on this, Teresa, might be with us this evening. But so Dee went around the 7 hills. You know the 7 hills of Dublin, the 7 hills of Rome. Well, there's 7 hills of Prague too. And he went around these 7 hills, and he enacted this ritual to call this big plasma storm. Now, he had announced to Queen Elizabeth 1 year ahead of time that he was going to be making this storm that would take out the Spanish Armada. And the meteorology of the storm that did take out the Spanish Armada came as a complete anomaly out of the North Sea like it never does. And the Spanish sailors blown to the west coast of England, who still speak Spanish there today, from that storm can testify that it was real. So what was this tornado steering activity? And maybe it's relevant to a planet right now that's having a little problem with too many storms. Oh yes, Terry Burns is with us. Hi, Terry. So we're trying to get together this school. We had a lovely school teaching these things in Torino with Kudai until Vincent Bridges, our hero on these things, had to go and die on us. He had just... Oh, it's Alan's here also. Well, Vincent had just written the play in which it's called The Donkey in the Cradle, which is the name of the theater, and he was living in Kelly's tower, and Kelly is the hero of Prague. And he had just finished the play. It was to be produced the next day, and you can do lots of conspiracy theory around this. And then Vincent had to go and die. And this is another lovely and complicated story. But basically, so this story of how John Dee cooked up the Tempest, the storm that took out the Spanish Armada, never got told. And I was with Vincent personally on several occasions when our Ophanum workings cooked up storms visibly the size of continents. I've seen it done. I know what it feels like. I've been there. It's related to Kundalini. You know, when Rolling Thunder was asked how he made rain, and he answered, oh, well, he's tickling the underside belly of a certain kind of black beetle. The same way Elizabeth Hayesh's son looks up, looking at the black scarab beetle, saying, ah, I just remembered my past lives. And he was looking in this little black hole. The reason the underside belly of this particular black beetle was particularly good for tickling to make rain was one of the most fractal nervous systems around. You can do something comparable to this by just picking up a really good pine cone and focusing on it and just checking to see if the clouds don't begin to form. It's like teaching a kid that's blissful and walking barefoot in the mud. Almost any one of those kids can put a hole in the cloud with their mind. And the physics is because their focused attention is centripetal, and that's the difference between water vapor and water that forms a droplet. This is called precipitation in physics and in magic. David Wilcox, yes, thank you for speaking about that. Joshua, maybe I'll just go up this list here and see if we forgot any fun questions. Yes, and Terry Burns is asking about why green, nature is green, the wavelength of growth. Oh yeah, we did have a little bit of discussion about green energy here. Well, just to return to that thought, in the article on fractal photosynthesis, we pointed out, let's see if we can find that here. In the article on fractal photosynthesis, where we're analyzing the geometry of color, here's the slide. We'll put that on the screen one more time. It'll show up in your screen in a second. So the question was, is green good or bad? And we're not saying, I'm not going to say either, but what I'm going to say is the physics appears to be that green prevents photosynthesis. So here's the graph from the biophysics literature of the color and wavelength of light that makes photosynthesis happen. And you see here very clearly that the purple and the orange exact golden ratio powers times Planck time and Planck length, produce exactly the frequencies that do make photosynthesis happen, purple and orange. So those frequencies cause photosynthesis. Whereas if you send a green photon down into that plant and the plant says, oops, can't swallow that one, spits it out, most every living plant on Earth spits out the green photons because they can't swallow. Why can it not swallow the green photon? Because at 90-degree phase angle, the green color, that green photon, is opposite to phase conjugate, opposite to charge distribution efficiency. Why 90 degrees is quote-unquote stressful or evil in Feng Shui and astrology, same physics. So a 90-degree angle is destructive interference for charge, therefore a 90-degree photon is destructive interference for light, therefore that charge can't be distributed or conjugated or imploded, and so phase conjugate implosive negentropic collapse wave called photosynthesis doesn't work for green. And that's called negative green in psychotronics. Now, this is not to say that green is evil, but it is to say that green is a color that plants cannot absorb, and this is evidence of something very interesting. And actually, they say when you wear green, you tend to absorb other people's feelings. You're more empathic because this is a color that's neutral to them. So there's a whole interesting study here. So if you study negative green in psychotronics. But again, we want to be very careful not to be childish and call things good and evil. We're not saying that tetracubes or non-conjugate structures are evil. No, nature uses tetracubic opposite to conjugate structures to isolate charge. Very good for charge isolation. Very bad for charge distribution. So hex tetracubic structures, wave interference, creates isolated charge, very good for stasis. Snowflakes are hex. You see, I put a hex on you, which is to fix the spell, whereas I put a pent on you is to send the spell. So it's simply a matter of understanding interference geometry. And this also relates to the fact that cancer cells are usually spherical, more hex, because they isolate charge, whereas healthy cells are always egg-shaped, because they project charge. And cells that can project their charge can share their charge distribution are the opposite of cancer. Okay. Let me see if there's other questions. In chronic healing, they say green is used to shrink cancer. Interesting. Well, green is a wavelength that does not permit charge distribution. So I'd like to make another interesting point about cancer was that when Bob Zawada first taught me about optical phase conjugation, he was the phase conjugate laser research operator of Roswell Park Memorial Cancer Institute. And the way he bumped into this was because they were using lasers to switch on and off medicine in the body. So you have to certain wavelength laser, and you could switch on and off a medicine right at the tumor, and therefore you could deliver the medicine just to the tumor. Well, they discovered that if you use lasers whose frequency cascade was golden ratio, then you could have the laser penetrate the body with the least amount of heat. Isn't that beautiful? Because that's the least amount of destructive interference. Okay, Eden Grace's question. If plants aren't able to conjugate entirely, why isn't there some variance in their gravity? With conjugate creating gravity, how is gravity fixed? Well, we do think, and actually Paul has been helping me dream up an experiment to prove what the phase conjugate cause of gravity hypothesis requires, which is that if you took heavy spheres and you arrange them in a dodecahedron, they will make more microgravity toward their center than if you don't arrange them in a dodecahedron. And in fact, this is why we hypothesize that the universe has more gravity in it than physics can figure it out, which is their only excuse for inventing this dumb idea called dark matter, because the universe's masses are documented to be arranged more dodecahedrally. And Brett is saying I can mess with clouds with my mind very easy. So Dan is correct. Yeah, Brett is our psychokinetic Anunnaki. Brett, you're so powerful. That's cool. But I wanted to go back to this about how gravity is fixed. Just one last final thought here. We're nearing the end of our little dialogue this evening, and we're going to move into our conversation phase. But here's one of the final thoughts I'd like to suggest. You're learning to do the Sufi dance. And remember, Sufi dance is like ritual. And ritual is like meiosis and mitosis. The proteins do this dance, so they align themselves in phase with the longer wave called cell division, meiosis, mitosis. So the perfect dance ritual is cell division, because the subcomponents of the cell have to align themselves with this ride the long wave Uncle Joe, and thus they produce embedding in that phase relationship, and that's what allows them to steer and produce cell division. So cell division is a Sufi dance for subcellular organelles. So you're doing the Sufi dance, and your Sufi teacher says, well, now follow your attention to your center of gravity inside you. And remember, your Sufi dance teacher is going to watch you next, and you're about to do this Sufi turn, and you get your hands up and you're starting to spin. And your Sufi dancer, as you start to do the Sufi whirl, and the Sufi dance teacher is going to decide if you have pure intention by whether or not you can do this dervish turn without getting dizzy. So how are you going to not get dizzy? And why does that require pure intention? Well, because the pure intention is the perfectly shareable wave that inhabits the center of spin, which is called inhabiting a lightning bolt. And so it is the good physics to know that if you have pure intention, then when you do the dervish turn, you will not get dizzy, and your Sufi teacher will find out if, in fact, you have pure intention. So your Sufi teacher is helping to instruct you to get ready for this test. And he says, well, find the center of gravity inside, which is presumably your heart, and hold your attention there. And then he says, now follow with your attention, to where gravity is pulling you down through the soles of your feet, and follow that wave. And now we know what that wave is. Remember the superluminal phase conjugate compression wave doing acceleration. And he says, follow this wave down into the center of gravity of the Earth. Remember when Bentoff's Stalking the Wild Pendulum, he says, when his aura got big and he'd feel it in the solar plexus, he could wiggle the planet with his plasma, stalking the wild pendulum. So follow your attention to the center of the Earth and become the gravity center of the Earth. And then if you're really good, you can follow with your attention, just like Jodie Foster did in the movie Contact, that wormhole that's centripetal through the speed of light, belly button, the plasma tube, to the heart of the sun. And when you arrive at the center of the sun, if you can feel the gravity field of the heart of the sun as if it were your own body, this is what is meant to become the sun god. This is what it meant to become Anu. Remember, they saw the heart of the sun clairvoyantly. They called it Anu. It was 7 spins, 5 spins, which is the same slip knot, the heart, the center of the heart muscle, the same slip knot, center of hydrogen. The Anu is 3 Anu per unit quark. So the point was that tracking a center of gravity with your attention is the same as tracking a wavefront phase coherence, the way you do to lucid dream, and producing perfect embedding in the center of a wave at a distance, exactly the way shamans see through the center of a tornado like an eyeball, or better, see through the center, the eye of an eagle, by perfectly embedding their plasma in the center of gravity of that tornado or that eagle, and becoming the center of lowest pressure, the implosive point, and thus creating the ability to see through that eye remotely. Or as Wayne just said, become a pine cone. So hopefully our conversation about the physics of gravity this evening has added something to our understanding of what it is to track with your attention the feeling of gravity as it moves from the center of your body to the center of the Earth to the center of the star. Because what we're saying is to be able to inhabit stars with your aura is not escapism. It's the only exit door from kindergarten to become a sun god, what they called, which is, we have this solar heart community at yahoogroups.com, all these shamans who talk about what it was like to see through the eye of the sun. They all report that when they embed themselves in the sun, the heart of the sun feels cool and inviting. It feels like an eyeball, and it's not hot at all. And they feel it that way because the center of fusion is the opposite of heat, actually. And that's a beautiful comment, Joshua. Thank you. All centripetal forces are intrinsically connected via entanglement, precisely. And we're just adding to that thought that perfected entanglement is the perfect embedding that phase conjugation permits. Exactly, exactly. So have we done some advanced physics here? I'm not so sure. I think we've talked about some aspects of implications for this new physics in a way that might be helpful, and at least provided some research articles and links that allow you to do some of your own homework. One of the things that we wanted to emphasize in tonight's class that was that we have new ways now to help all wave systems emerge from chaos. You know, the example was you took the fluorescent light out of your kid's class, you installed sunlight, and you measured dramatic increase in attention span. Well proven, John Ott, Health and Light. The physics was because embeddable conjugate optical frequencies produce attention. So we can now extend that. We can make capacitive, we can make magnetic environments, we can make plasma environments, we can make Therify.net that produce attention. They produce attention span, they produce focus, and therefore bliss, because they produce non-destructive compression. Applied to the Earth, you can measure the frequencies of the Schumann resonance under the Bosnian pyramid. Thank you to Sam for this. And 500,000 people a year are coming for rejuvenation there. And the reason is because where the Schumann harmonics are stronger, you get this phase conjugate pump wave, because we know the low frequencies of the Schumann are the perfect frequencies for phase conjugate collapse, which is why we feed them to our brain to make bliss, and why we feed them to Therify.net to make healing. So The ancients, if you read the book 2/3 by David Myers and David Percy, the ancients called the pyramids the Hummer. Why did they call it a Hummer? Well, Sam is saying, oh, well, in this underneath this Bosnian pyramid, we've got these infrasound frequencies, and they conjugate, they interfere, and they contain the plasma balls, and they're seeing all these plasma balls down there, one of which is called the Holy Fire in Jerusalem. It's a related phenomenon. So that interferometry is creating centripetal force, and that's profoundly rejuvenating. And the other thing is, those layers of that pyramid, again, as Sam Osmanagich documents, have muscovite, which is a phase conjugate high dielectric, and quartz, the high piezo, and then the organic clay, which makes what's called orgone, which is a phase conjugate dielectric. So you have these layers of capacitance arranged at a conjugate angle, and then you have this conjugate pump wave, low frequency infrasound, and coherent Schumann harmonic cascade. And all this is pumping this implosive negentropic, which is making this flame, which is profoundly rejuvenating. And now they're saving the economy of Bosnia. So many people are coming there because they realize they're getting younger. And Sam's website about the Bosnian pyramid is documenting lots and lots of people are having healing experiences, which is why he just ordered a Therify.net, because that's the perfect environment to create rejuvenation. So the actual hermetic principle is rejuvenation because, yes, so, and Joshua comments, so these frequencies would be ideal for optimizing fertility if people are struggling to become pregnant. Yeah, even more than that. When Phil Callahan documented that the ancient Celtic stone towers, they rearranged the dirt level to tune it, and the frequency he measured at the dirt level that they used for birth was 1,000 hertz, which is documented to be anesthetic. So there was a lot to these critical frequencies. And Diana says, Kapirin. That's what we did tonight. Big thanks, Dan. Greetings from Prague. So Diana's our alchemy ultimate. Thank you, Diana. Diana says, few friends told me that few women gave birth in that place. Interesting. Because the theory here would be that the ancients used what was called Shem, later translated to mean altar in the church, which as we now know is an implosive capacitance. Lawrence Gardner calls it Highward Firestone. But we know the ancients used these places for birth and death. And this is exactly how non-destructive compression happens, which is how you get your memories into the collective unconscious, the communion of saints, which we now know is a phase conjugate dielectric, phase conjugate field called sacred space, which is actually perfected charge distribution. So now there is an electrical engineering hygiene for birth and death, which teaches about charge distribution, which tells you why a hospital is hell for birth and death, because of the electrosmog. Because you can't do embedding, you can't do implosion. So when Karakov measured sacred space, where the Kogi went to make phone calls to ancestors, he was actually measuring fractal air. So it is now 10 o'clock, and I have been talking too much. We had a little bit of fun here. And so this is the part at which we're supposed to do a more open dialogue, discussion, conversation, question and answer. And feel free to ask questions in the chat window, or feel free to turn on your microphone and ask questions that way as you wish. And this is more the open discussion mode in terms of, let's even ask the question, is there something practical enough here that we can apply? And what are our next steps? Okay, Sarah says, how would one get more fractal air in their personal space or work environment? Sarah, I give you the example of the actual director of architecture of Saudi Arabia, who arrived here in my living room about a year ago, who realized that the Saudi people were dying from too much air conditioning. I mean, literally dying. Now, what he realized was, what I explained electrically, was that the air conditioners, usually with metal fins, is depleting the capacitance of the air. And when the capacitance, the charge density of the air molecule is gone, there is no charge to allow the oxygen molecule to sustain solubility. So if you go into an air-conditioned room, which is the opposite of life force and fractal air, the first thing you do is yawn. And the reason you're yawning is because yawning is your brain telling you, I need oxygen desperately. And that oxygen has lost solubility. So what we're saying is most air-conditioned air is very bad for life force. Now, there are forms of air conditioning which are better in that regard, which is natural convection of water that's done where the steam in the water is dissolved correctly, and you can actually produce cooling that does not fractionate the air. So that's one example. The other examples, of course, are reducing the electrosmog, reducing the amount of metal, steel, and aluminum, particularly large metal surfaces are very depleting to the capacitance in the air and therefore the life force. For example, we know for sure for the cellular healing technology that was negative ion wind therapy, cell care therapy in Scotland, powerful negative ion wind, they could knock out spinal meningitis, all kinds of infection. Powerful negative ion wind, well documented to be bacteriostatic. But these systems would only work in a room full of natural materials. If you get a room full of metal and plastic, the system doesn't work at all. Why? Because the negative ions are fragile, they're fractal, and they break in a non-fractal environment. So you need charge-dense air and natural fabric. Another way of talking about this is to say that the more biologic material in your environment, wood and stone and natural fabric, every molecule that became part of biology became more fractal and more charge distribution efficient. And so the capacitance of your aura can breathe efficiency. That's called high dielectric constant. What that means is that a capacitor that's high dielectric as the insulator, you can ring like a bell, and it'll ring forever. So the resonance of your charge can efficiently resonate in a house made of natural materials. Let's see, next question. How would NASA agenda keep people disempowered? Informed, aware, capable, powerful people are the threat to national security. The NSA goes to great lengths. But, well, yes. I mean, I suppose we could call the NSA the bad guys. I have an uncle in the NSA. And it's pretty easy to call it evil, but I think a lot of it is ignorance. So I'm going to operate on the optimistic hypothesis here, a little bit as opposed to conspiracy theory, by saying that if we do enough education, then the evil goes away, because most of evil is actually dumbness. I use the example of George Bush. Maybe I should say no more. But no, I mean, we joke that George Bush did not know that the actual political function of government is to produce bliss, because that's the only way you get enough aura to have an immune system and to be immortal. And therefore, the purpose of government is to make bliss. And George Bush didn't know. Well, the problem was education. Maybe that's a way of not being paranoid about conspiracy theory. Okay, let's see. Can you give specifics on how we can rearrange our rooms and environment like a rose in good harmonics? We have this website, goldenmean.info/geobiology, where we use Stefan Cardino's work. But in brief, the sequence of steps are, you have eliminated as much electrosmog. You really need to turn off that Wi-Fi, probably Ethernet cables are better, and all the transformers are out or in one corner far away from you, et cetera, et cetera. You really got to work on the electrosmog bit. It's a serious issue. And then you eliminate as much metal as you can and get the biological materials, and then you get fresh air in that room, et cetera. And then you learn how to dowse. Because if you can't feel a magnetic line, you can't be a magnetic line. It's actually true. So, and then, and maybe you get a dowser to help you. But to feel a magnetic line is very important. So then you begin to rearrange those magnetic lines to look like a rose. Good exercises to learn how to make a labyrinth. goldenmean.info/labyrinth. And you begin to visualize the magnetic pattern. And the other thing is, actually, the room you spend the most time in your house, or the room that you really want to own, you should experiment with making a little altar. A sacred space. You should have a bit of a sacred space, your personal altar somewhere, and you begin to focus your thoughts there, your meditations, and gradually there's a bit of chi, charge, orgone, baraka, shaktipat that builds around your altar. Joshua Pronk, what do you think of David Wilcock's theory of solar system-wide global warming? Could this be leading to more turbulent collective unconscious and therefore more storms and chaotic weather? Well, that galactic wave theory by Paul Laviolette was based on the idea that the galactic superwave was increased dust in our area of the solar system as we crossed this critical cross point of the galactic equator. And there is quite a bit of evidence that many of the planets are experiencing abnormal heating at this time. So there's some evidence of the galactic superwave theory. Now, so galaxy warming could be related to this phenomenon of crossing the galactic equator, which was sometimes incorrectly labeled the photon cloud. But certainly a time of increased compression is a time when we most need to understand this concept of conjugate fractality. For example, I believe the physics of why they say during the rapture guns will melt and you do not want to be the left behind if you listen to the religious fundamentalists. But I believe the physics is the reason that during the rapture the guns will melt is that during a phase conjugate compression wave, anything that has the wrong dielectric is going to generate heat, including your aura. And that's what it means to go to hell. So I'm not telling you to go to hell. I'm saying instead, go to Hey Ave, the place where charge distribution. Oh, these religious metaphors. Now we have a jokes from Gary Clark about just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you. Yeah. No, really, I think conspiracy theory is, it's true. There is a lot of negative things happening on our planet. On the other hand, probably we should attend to mostly those things we know we can do something about and not indulge in any kind of conspiracy theory unless there's strong evidence and unless we actually believe there's something we can do something about it. Otherwise, we're best to focus constructively on what we can serve. Diana says, what do you think of Ibrahim Karim's use of forms to change the effect of harmful frequencies? I had a big fight with Ibrahim Karim once because he said, I know what negative green is because I can kill you with it. And I said, just because you know how to kill with a gun doesn't mean you know how the gun works. No, actually, Ibrahim Karim, I think, is doing some great work. And calling it biogeometry probably is not helpful, but still he's teaching people how shapes create growth. Unfortunately, if he learned to use electrical engineering language, like, for example, high dielectrics and constructive charge interference for why that seed grew faster in that pentagram, etc. But, Wilhelm Reich had some of the same trouble. By insisting on calling it orgone instead of conjugating dielectric, he alienates every scientist on the planet, and therefore there will be no communication. So that's why it's so important that we always use the same language. But that criticism of Ibrahim Karim is actually minor in compared to the work he's doing, helping people understand some wonderful things. So, we have a little semantic difference of opinion, but that's minor compared to the work of actually teaching people how to create life force. So let's be diplomatic about this. Lisa says, Dan, do you have a list of all the subpage on your so informative website? Well, goldenmean.info has a huge index right at the home page. And also, I would say that although Google's former CIA owners stopped indexing, in fact, Bing has excellent indexing of goldenmean.info, which is our biggest. So if you type in, use Bing search engine and type in keyword space site :goldenmean.info, you can search very nicely. But you have to balance this with positivity because intention collapses charge. That's right, we're balancing this positivity, yes. Oh, and thank you for mentioning biogeometry.com, biogeometry.org. Those are Ibrahim Karim's very useful websites as well as useful work. So, Sarah's question. Is there something that would improve a classroom's environment, children's ability to focus, where a teacher will not turn off the toxic lighting. Shungite, Himalayan salt lamps, ? Well, you know, to produce attention, you need diet, you need movement, you need meditation. Can you teach that? Can you encourage that teacher to teach some form of yoga? Can you persuade that teacher to read the book Health and Light? Can you persuade that teacher to begin to teach why sugar in white flour prevents attention? Can you persuade that teacher to read a little bit of Steiner, where he explains why the children should only touch wood and natural fabric and natural stone, and children should never even touch metal and plastic? Why? Because if you can't inhabit it with your aura, it can't become part of your mind. It's perfectly good physics. Maybe you can persuade that teacher to read the curriculum, goldenmean.info/Steiner. We translate the anthroposophic biodynamic Waldorf school, some of their curriculum key terminologies into science. For example, when they teach the children in the Steiner school, first they draw very accurate pictures of the stage of a rose unpacking, popping open. And then they say, now children, now that you've visualized this so clearly, close your eyes and imagine very accurately, with lots of feeling, the rose popping open inside your mind. And the more clearly you can visualize this will prove your success. And the way they find out if the children did their homework in that class is if the room fills with the smell of roses. And we understand that physics perfectly well because, in fact, it is the flowering brain. We know the physics of olfaction of infrared. And, in fact, if you make this flower inside your head, the infrared you produce inside your head is the physics of smell. And if you've ever watched, and I have, hummingbirds crashing into a window because a lady inside a sealed house is having intense bliss experience and the hummingbird is desperate to get to the nectar, you know that infrared is going through the glass. And that's the physics of smell. And Professor Phil Callahan proved that, and we made a film with him on that subject. Okay, next question. How can we optimize government structures for golden ratio phase conjugate compression? In the casing of designing a new civilization structure, can we be done at the current state of consciousness? Will leadership still remain? Well, the difference between hierarchy and fractality is we have a new announcement tonight. Launching a new project. It's called fractaleconomics.net. And we haven't even announced it yet, but actually we have started with inspiration from Sasha Stone and others. Fractaleconomics.net is up and started, and how to invent a fractal economic system, because we know that money is only a symbol for human energy. It's not evil, and energy perfectly distributed is called fractal. So perfected distribution of money and perfected distribution of charge is the same fractal principle. So it should be possible to design fractal economics based on perfect sharing for waves, for people, and for money. And so check out fractaleconomics.net and help me finish that project. But in fact, and you know, there's a lot of precedent for that. There's the sharing theory in the Ananda Marga. And there's lots of people that have tried that. But once you understand the actual principles of fractal distribution of charge, you can design a fractal structure for business leadership. You can design fractal corporate design, which is all based on perfect scaling. And perfect scaling is what corporations need. How do you make little projects turn into big projects non-destructively? You need perfect scalability. Corporations talk about it all the time. And they call, and you know, economic consultants call this the grand attractor of their business. And the perfect grand attractor, which is a keyword all economics use, is now fractal. So fractal economics is an idea whose time has come. Help me share this idea. And so this is what we will do to our governments. We will make it perfectly fractal. Emptied classroom, remove the light plane, biogeometry shape. Yes, soft warrior phase conjugating. Yes, yes, harmonize. Yes, so basically it is the physics of Feng Shui. You know, Feng Shui taught as pure science is a beautiful, beautiful principle where people actually visualize the waves of charge in a room and see that what's rose-like fractality is actually sacred space forming. Robert Rivard, a bit of philosophy. You mentioned once to orient your life to highest service. Does the attitude of being of service create a certain electrical bliss momentum? In a way, I tie this to the debate of the transcendent God. God is other than myself, immanent God. Inside or outside? If the inside is like the outside, then God is both. No, but where the context in which we mentioned that bit about highest level of service was when Jas Maheen was teaching people to thrive without food. And we have friends in our Torino group, for example, very powerful, healthy people, and they don't eat ever. They've learned, and Jas Maheen teaches there. I'm not saying you need to learn to live without food, but it's a very powerful exercise to practice for a while. But one of the key things, you know, you need to learn to breathe, to absorb prana, and then you need to learn to walk barefoot and in nature and sacred space so that you can, again, absorb charge. So basically the food is the charge. It's simple physics, just like they said in Celestine Prophecy, all human interactions about charge. But then the other thing that Jas Maheen teaches was that you needed to spend a significant part of your day doing whatever it is you passionately believe is your highest level of service. And that was the beautiful example, just to say, why does that, believing that you're doing what is of max service, why is that what then allows you to implode enough charge so you don't need food? It's other ways of saying follow your bliss, obviously. But it's also a little bit about this Jungian psychoanalysis of Eros Thanatos, that the reason the urge to die exists, the thanatotic urge, is because you no longer believe you can serve. So unconsciously, if you come to a point in your life where you don't believe you can serve, then your body switches the telomeres and you start dying. Whereas, in fact, if you believe you're doing your highest level of service, you're going to be imploding charge. You not only do not need food, but you don't need to die. So, and the other part of that was that death was only invented by biology to teach us to stop storing unshareable thoughts. Because, in fact, if every moment of every day you're only thinking pure principle, that means that you're having a eureka, your hair is standing up, and therefore you're continuously absorbing charge, and therefore you never die. So the only reason you die is because you stored an unshareable idea. If every moment of your life you're storing ideas and memories and emotions which are of service to all of DNA, which is called pure principle, then you absorb so much charge you don't need to die. So death was just a convenient tool for nature to teach us to try to stop, nature to teach us to stop storing what is unshareable. Joshua, wouldn't it be the definition of prosperity, fractal economics? Absolutely, that's the whole idea, that actually prosperity is perfected distribution. I mean, basically, on this planet, abundance is all over us. You know, if we eliminated everything we spent on insurance and banking and military, everyone on this planet would be so rich, nobody would need anything. There'd be total, absolute. So all we have to do is learn to share well. And, and how do we do that? Well, perfect sharing is called fractality among waves, so it's called fractal economics. Okay, fractal fields rule. Yeah, thank you. Why do you think human beings in our modern day and age lack negative ions, leading to their intrinsic healing quality? Yes, well, okay, we just learned that there's a hydrogen product. It's amazing. Where's this bottle here? There's a hydrogen. It's these. Hydrogen is like the ultimate free radical scavenger. This is it. This is it. And hydrogen is pure implosion, obviously. It's like microhydrogen times 10. It's sort of very powerful. And you nanobubble hydrogen implosion in water, you get the ultimate healing spa, imploderspa.com, which is now fountainoflife.today, which is a hot subject in Japan. They're doing healing spas all over with nanobubble hydrogen. So negative ions are fragile, just like this hydrogen ion because it's going to pop and implode any second. So the first time a negative ion hits the metal on the surface of your computer, it's gone. So implosion requires an implosive atmosphere to be sustained for the same reason that the Kogi could only make phone calls to their ancestors where the air was fractal, which Korotkov measured and proved. So negative ions are fragile because they're fractal. And fractal environments are required to maintain fractal charge. So until we learn to make fractal environments, which is to say where there's life force and live air and living materials, where charge compression and charge distribution is efficient, then we can't create negative ions. We can't create healing environments. We can't create centripetal forces. So basically, when they said this is the Holy Spirit, what they meant was this is simply a place where waves can distribute their charge perfectly, and this was called the principle of Christos and the quality of grace. Joshua asks, are positive ions fractal as well? You know, this might be a question we could also pass on to Mark in his next course when he explains how the proton got embedded in the electron shells by conjugation. If you think about it, actually, that it is common in physics parlance to talk about electrons as little black holes. That is very common. And it's common to talk about protons as black holes in Nassim's way of talking about it. But what they mean by black hole in every case is simply where waves got centripetal enough to stand in one place, the chem principle. Just wondering why there are more positive ions in the body than average. Exactly. Whereas the more negative ions in your body, the more you're centripetal. And that's true also of hydrogen. So they say that if you actually absorb enough hydrogen, you get immortal, this Primo product. Thank you for typing in this information about Primo. The expert on that was with us in Belgium. And Diana says, can too much hydrogen be harmful? Possibly. Too many negative ions can be harmful. It can burn. It's true. But they say that this particular, like microhydrogen, you know, Pat Flanagan was famous for dumping a cubic yard of microhydrogen crystal into his spa. And you had this intense bliss experience. But I think, actually, when you get that centripetal, you get slightly shortened attention span. There's another question there. But it's true that it's like saying, is it possible to have too much bliss? And the answer is yes, actually. You absorb a lot of charge, like you get to the center of lightning bolt, and then you need to make that shareable before you can go back and absorb more. So it's like, oh, I'm sitting here having my bliss experience. Unless I can take that out and make that of use to my civilization, I'm not entitled to more, and I will burn out, quite literally. So yes, you know, you can only stay at the center of a lightning bolt so long, and then you take that charge and you distribute it, and then you go back and you deserve some more. Otherwise, you become a bliss ninny and you become ungrounded. So becoming grounded is literally the physics of getting fractal or getting dead. And getting grounded, we recommend the book Earthing. It's profoundly healing. Access to ground is access to a fractal. Selfless service, sacrifice, and surrender, the key to connecting with everyone. Thank you, John Fanuzzi. Hey, John, why don't we put up your website with all your cool graphics here? John has some of the most beautiful sacred geometry graphics. He's been working on this. He's got beautiful pictures. So type your website in there, John, so we can send people to your beautiful pictures. Joshua, does plasma taper off into charge? Thank you. So John Fanuzzi's website, internalstargate.com. He's done some amazing graphics on the pine cones kissing noses, and we've been playing with John for so many years. I really love it that you're here, John. Thank you, thank you. There's beautiful, beautiful pictures there. Check out internalstargate.com. Joshua, does plasma taper off into charge? Is charge just a less dense version of plasma? Yes, yes. You see, this is the fundamental physics we're trying to understand deeply and powerfully here. When Elizabeth Rauscher asked me at the conference in Budapest, what is charge? It took me a little while to answer, but actually I believe strongly that charge is just the compression and rarefaction of the ether of the background. And therefore, compression and rarefaction is plus and minus charge. It's just the compressibility of that is the actual ether itself. So what is a plasma cloud? A plasma is a cloud of charge. That's all it is. Normally, physics thinks that you have to have heat to hold a cloud of charge in one place. But if there's something centripetal and phase conjugate and not heat producing at the center, then you have cold plasma. Fractalfield.com/cold plasma, which is, for example, the monoatomics like Keshe's cold plasma, or the cold plasma, which is your aura, which you take through death. So cold plasma is the blue flyer, the light that does not consume, and the evidence that we're making it at Therify.net is the fact that the finger that got healed also got cooler. So it is possible to create implosion and produce absence of heat. So plasma and charge are the spiritual world, ? Different levels of heaven correlating to their relative density. Well, we say heaven, hey ave, means where the breath of charge can ave, fly. In the same way the plains of Sharon, Lawrence Gardner said, is the Hebrew term for heaven, because the plains of Sharon is the infinite charge field around monoatomic gold, the perfect popcorn for capacitance. And so being in a perfectly distributed charge environment is absolutely the physics of heaven. So electrical engineers need to teach us how to make hospitals and graveyards, or we will not enter heaven. It's really powerful, important physics. Wayne says, will we find out when Keshe's units come into action? If they do, hopefully tomorrow, Mark, our lead physicist, and Paul, our lead plasma engineer, will be meeting tomorrow with Keshe's lead hardware engineer, Armin, in Los Angeles, and we will have engineering documentation on the prototype and then answer the question in more detail. Joshua says, is the sun a stargate to other solar systems? My answer would be definitely yes. The sun is the only being with enough inertial escape velocity to exit our solar system into the galaxy. So all of the high beings come as a plasma cloud through the heart of the sun. So the joke was that if your ET arrived in heavy metal, they're probably from the wrong side of the tracks. Whereas if your extraterrestrial arrived as a cloud of plasma, angelically, intelligently coming through the heart of the sun, then they're worth talking to. And this is why all of the ancient spiritual traditions talk about sun gods, Anu. So yes, absolutely the sun. And any shaman can tell you that if you can't project your aura, your plasma through the heart of the sun, then you didn't grow up yet. How does light turn into matter? In other words, how does a photon actually create protons and neutrons? Well, the electron, when it collapses between shells, always collapses in an even number of photons. That is the name for quantum mechanics. That's called being quantized. So clearly, photons are the packets which quantize the electron shells. So one study of electron quantum mechanics is proof that photons are the reason electrons exist, and similarly neutrons and protons. So that's really old physics, but not enough of us have studied that actually. The thing that's more interesting is what allows the photons to gather to stand as waves long enough to embed into the wave envelope called electron and proton. And this is new information, that it's phase conjugation that makes them centripetal enough to stay in one place. Obviously, gravity is how an electron learns, an atom learns how to stay in one place. But how did the electron make gravity? It made gravity because it was phase conjugating. And I proved that when I wrote the new equation, proving the radii of hydrogen are phase conjugate. So hydrogen's proton stays at the center because phase conjugation holds it there, and that's how it makes gravity, and that's how it stands in one place. So the new information here is not how photons make electrons. That's old information. The new information is how phase conjugation allows protons and electrons to have gravity and thus stay in one place. Sorry, guys, we just had a little bit of we just had a little internet crash here, but we had a fun night. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for your encouragement. And stay tuned. There's lots more fun to come. You can communicate with us anytime. info@fractalfield.com. And we hope you enjoyed. We hope you come to the next class. Perhaps you'll enjoy meeting Mark more at his advanced physics class. And notice the class with Sarah is upcoming. So more to come with the fun. Thank you for your patience with us tonight. And see you next time. Blessings. Sweet dreams. Yeah, Gary is suggesting Mark to try a new microphone. Yeah, that's a good idea. But I think the ideas that got together here were wonderful. So thank you again, guys. I'm going to turn off the recording now. Blessings.